Intergenerational trauma, or inherited trauma, has become a significant talking point when it comes to Aboriginal Australians. The concept suggests that trauma can be passed down not just through learnt behaviours and family dynamics, something that I can completely understand, but also through DNA, a process called epigenetics, which is thought to allow trauma to affect future generations biologically. It's worth noting that this concept is still being debated in human studies, understandably. At first glance, it sounds a bit far-fetched, maybe even absurd. Take my own family, for example, though the images you see are AI-generated. My mother struggled with mental health issues after being raised by a single mother during wartime. My grandmother, who had 5 other children to care for after my grandfather's early passing, faced immense challenges. Due to illness, my mother spent months at a time in a hospital in another city, alone, often mistreated by staff. Naturally, her experiences shaped how she raised me and in turn affected my mental health. But does that mean I literally inherited her trauma, her hospital stay, her mistreatment on a biological level? That idea seems questionable, yet I'm willing to keep an open mind. The ABC recently covered this topic in a piece titled Healing from Inherited Trauma as a Stolen Generation's Descendant, which I missed, but thanks to a viewer for pointing it out. This is Laura Jones, who told the ABC, "I'm a descendant of the stolen generations. I'm going to assume most people can relate to the wound of abandonment. But when actual abandonment goes back generations, that can still affect you now. That was when I realised there was some stuff to work on here so that I don't carry it on to the next generation." This is Ms. Jones' grandmother, Auntie Lorraine Peters, who has an Indigenous understanding of trauma. When she was 4 years old, she and her 5 sisters were stolen from their parents and placed in a domestic training home for Aboriginal girls. At 15, she was sent to work as a servant for a white rural family. Now Ms. Peters heals when she visits her birthplace in Western New South Wales. No disrespect, but is heals the right word? Isn't it more a case of her simply feeling good when she visits the countryside? Isn't that what it is, rather than healing? The article discusses science and Indigenous wisdom, stating, "Inherited trauma is a phenomenon that's only gained acceptance in Western circles relatively recently through epigenetics." There's that word again. Scientists are discovering factors like environment and experiences can influence how particular genes are switched on and off, and some of these patterns are passed on to offspring. For Auntie Lorraine and Ms. Jones, science is just catching up to something talked about among their families for decades. Okay, so apparently they knew something about this before we did, and the article asserts it outright. Indigenous understanding of intergenerational trauma having a biological link predates Western science. Concepts like trauma load being passed through the mother to a fetus are shared through storytelling and oral tradition. "Most Aboriginal people just know it," Auntie Lorraine said. "If I don't heal in my generation, it's automatically transferred onto my children." It sounds a bit like pseudoscience to me, but who am I to judge? Look, I'm not trying to dismiss Aboriginal knowledge, but this story seems to imply that Aboriginal people were ahead of Western science in understanding genetics and gene expression. Did oral traditions and storytelling directly mention genes and DNA sequencing? I'm not saying Aboriginal Australians weren't knowledgeable pre-colonisation. They certainly were. They learnt to understand and survive in a land that was often hostile and unforgiving. I'm certainly not saying they were inferior to Europeans. They were just different. But suggesting that Aboriginal people had an understanding of science comparable to or ahead of European scientific knowledge, that's certainly a stretch. The article states that Western science initially viewed intergenerational trauma through psychological and social lenses, such as learnt behaviour from traumatised caregivers. Fair enough, that makes sense. But advances in the last 30 years have provided evidence that some genetic expressions or marks on certain genes may be inherited. For example, a 2013 study conditioned male mice to fear a specific odour by administering an electric shock whenever the smell was released. their offspring showed sensitivity to the same odour, despite never experiencing the shock themselves. However, the ABC acknowledges that in humans, this remains hotly debated. Okay, let's assume this is true, that trauma can be inherited. Then wouldn't that apply to all of us? If we look at our family histories, it's almost certain that at least one of our recent ancestors experienced trauma, because none of us have lived through a perfect past. My mother suffered trauma while locked up in a hospital. My grandmother faced trauma as a widow, raising children alone without a husband to support her. Trauma is not exclusive to Aboriginal people. We have all experienced suffering in one form or another. And here's my final question, one posed by a viewer. Where does this victim mentality for past injustices end? How about it stops with those who directly experienced it?